I find that Bernanke is the greatest counterfeiter in the history of the world. He has created new dollars out of thin air more than anybody else, and we happen to have the reserve currency of the world. So I don't see him as being a savior. He's the participant, and he is a counterfeiter.
Aloha, and thank you for watching Hawaii Political Reporter. Tonight, deception by U.S. presidents produces unwanted and unnecessary war and debt. We find out the truth about Obama, the Bushes, Reagan, and Clinton. We also find out how Roosevelt provoked the Japanese to attack Pearl Harbor and withheld information that could have averted or mitigated the Pearl Harbor attack. But first...
Hey, Uncle, I've got more letters for you. PlDC.
Holy tilapia. I'm still recovering from IRP, PEIS, OMG, and all that.
Sorry, but this one is even more important. PlDC is Public Land Development Corporation. It's a dummy corporation. It can buy things and then give them to the state, say for $1. It can do things the state isn't allowed to do. It's a way for the state government to develop public lands without public input or environmental review. It's a way to get around inconvenient laws or regulations.
So government wants to break their own laws. How can they do that?
Well, it takes a law to break the law. The PlDC was created by Act 55, sponsored by Senators De La Cruz and Solomon in 2011. It slipped through the legislature without a fight. Only 9 representatives and Senator Ihara voted no. I'm not sure they all understood what they were voting for.
How can they expect all of us to follow the rules if they break them themselves?
That's an interesting question.
So this corporation, what do they want to use it for?
Well, the story keeps changing. First they said fix a few harbors and create extra funds for park maintenance. Now they say we need public-private partnerships to build schools, workforce housing, senior facilities, and preschools. The point is, the PlDC can do most anything. Sell off parks, bulldoze open space and shorelines, put in windmills and the undersea cable, or maybe even develop Hawaiian homelands. It can do whatever the governor's appointees wants it to do. Condemn land, levy bonds, there's really no limit. It's so broad, private interests can use it to pluck our state like a chicken.
I knew we would get back to KFC, so the people know about this. I think we have to warn them.
Last month, there was a series of meetings on different islands to get the input on the PlDC administrative rules. There was strong opposition and protest at every meeting.
So why don't they forget about it?
Well, the governor says the more we protest, the more he wants it. The protesters didn't run for office, and he did. He says he doesn't work for those who speak out.
You know, when this governor talks, he starts to remind me of President Nixon. Back then, there were huge protests. Nixon said he just worked for the silent majority.
You mean they only listen to the people who aren't talking?
It just means they're not listening at all. So how do we fight this?
We can pressure the legislature to repeal the law, but the bigger problem is what it says about our government.
What do they mean?
The way I see it, the PlDC, like the environmental waiver that was defeated in the last session, is a confession of failing. Like a bankruptcy, our governor and legislature are admitting they can't make government work. They say they're desperate to cut through government bureaucracy, but bureaucracy is their own staff, and helping staff solve problems for the public is the job we elect them to do. So the enemy they're targeting is themselves. With the PlDC, they're throwing up their hands and saying, let's invite private corporations to do our job for us. Unless we elect people who can make government work, we could lose control of the AINA altogether.
You know, before I joined the Army, I worked on a plantation, and that's a hard life. When I came back to Hawaii, I thought the plantation days was over. Now I'm not sure.
You might be right, Uncle. If we let politicians sell off our state to big corporations, we could all end up cutting cane for $1 a day.
No. Us old people, our lights is going to go out like this. But first, we have to protect the children and the grandchildren. from those politicians.
I am Kanoho Helm, and I approve this commentary.
The people are so fearful and desperate that they'll believe the thinnest veneer has substance to it. And so they have this hope. And hope, by the way, is the most negative word in the metaphysical dictionary. It means nothing. You know, it means wishing that you scratch off that lotto number and win without doing anything.
As president, I will end misguided defense policies and stand with caucus priorities in fighting special interests in Washington. I don't posture on defense policy, and I don't take money from federal lobbyists for powerful defense contractors.
Look who Obama just brought in as his deputy defense secretary, a chief lobbyist for one of the greatest of all of the military-industrial complex companies, Raytheon.
As of today, lobbyists will be subject to stricter limits than under any other administration in history.
Which basically means, it is saying, we will mostly put tough new restrictions on lobbyists, except when we won't. If you have no intention of abiding by your new rules, then don't make new rules. That would be actual transparency.
People out there do not want lobbyists for the military-industrial complex running the Pentagon.
First, I'll stop spending $9 billion a month in Iraq.
If you look at Obama's voting record, I mean, he has voted to, not to end the war. He has voted to finance the war.
I'm the only major candidate who opposed this war from the beginning.
He wants to send more troops into Afghanistan. He wants to broaden the military. So I think it's a fraud what he's talking about.
And as president, I will end it.
In an interview last week on PBS, the defense chief, Robert Gates, was asked how many American troops he thought might still be in Iraq 3+ years from now. He thought there would be a residual force of U.S. troops in Iraq that numbered in the several tens of thousands. Several tens of thousands of U.S. troops indefinitely staying in Iraq, even beyond the country-to-country agreement we just signed with Iraq that says we'll leave. Boy, if you are one of the 70% of Americans who wants U.S. troops out of Iraq on that 16-month timetable that Obama promised, I bet you are glad about this election we just had, huh? Getting rid of that old administration that sees several tens of thousands of American troops indefinitely in Iraq for years. Wow, good thing we are saying goodbye to George W. Bush's Defense Secretary, Bob Gates. And now we're saying hello to Barack Obama's Defense Secretary, Bob Gates.
We've got 130,000 Americans fighting halfway across the world in a war that should have never been waged, led by leaders who have no plan to end it. We don't have time to be cynical.
The U.S. may try to get around the just signed requirement that U.S. combat troops be out of Iraqi cities by June of next year by massaging the meaning of the word combat. You ready? Quote, military planners are now quietly acknowledging that many troops will stay behind as renamed trainers and advisors in what are effectively combat roles. In other words, they will still be engaged in combat, just called something else.
We don't have time to be cynical. We don't have time.
So, Iraq withdrawal? Not really a withdrawal. And as for Afghanistan, well, there's not even a semantic pretense of withdrawal plans there. A massive U.S. troop buildup is in the works, according to the Associated Press today. Quote, all told, the U.S. could nearly double its troop levels there to as many as 60,000, sending up to 4 combat brigades and thousands of support forces within the next year.
I don't switch positions or make promises that can't be kept.
Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, these countries are tiny compared to the Soviet Union. They don't pose a serious threat to us. Iran, they spend 1/100th of what we spend on the military. I mean, if Iran ever tried to pose a serious threat to us, they wouldn't stand a chance.
Iran is a grave threat. It has an illicit nuclear program. It supports terrorism across the regions and militias in Iraq. It threatens Israel's existence.
So let's recap here. not withdrawal in Iraq, potentially doubling forces in Afghanistan. Oh, and there's also that escalating as yet undeclared war in Pakistan, where officials claim another U.S. drone killed at least 7 people today.
This is the administration of a Democrat, said on his election form, Jimmy Carter, Trilateral Commission member, also Council on Foreign Relations. Democrats, and here's administrations, here's CFR, TC, Trilateral Commission, Council on Foreign Relations. This is more Jimmy Carter, more of the same organizations coordinating policy through this apparently elected administration. So then you get to 1980 and you think, oh, well, I'm fed up with them Democrats, and of course I'm in a democracy, and so therefore I can choose someone different because I want to change the policy, you know, and it's great being in the land of the free and all that. And so you choose Ronald Reagan. His chief advisors up there were David Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger, 2 of the great brotherhood manipulators of the 20th century. And then again, the names change in these various positions, but the coordinating bodies do not. CFR, TC, everywhere. More Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was a non-member, but he didn't have to be, did he, Ron? He read the autocue, did as he was told, like they all do. But he was a member of other secret groups and, of course, Bohemian Grove, as we saw earlier. Again, here you have the ambassadors, the Congress, the State Department, CFR, TC. So then you move on to George Bush. So there again, another administration, different names, same coordinating bodies. More George Bush, same again. So then you get to, what is it, 1992, and you say, well, I'm fed up with them Republicans. They've had all these terms, and you know, with Reagan and Bush, and I think we ought to have a change. And so along comes Slick Will from the Windsor bloodline from Arkansas, and he starts saying that he stands for change, and I stand for change, and vote for me, we need change. That was his mantra throughout that election. Well, let's see how the change took place. Here's Bill, member of all of them, got the full set. And there again, different names. We're Democrat now because it says so. Same coordinating body. Bill Clinton administration again, same coordinating bodies.
Secretary of the Treasury, Timothy Geithner, Bilderberg Group and Trilateral Commission member. Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, Bilderberg and CFR member. Ambassador to the United Nations, Susan Rice, Trilateral Commission. National Security Advisor General James L. Jones, Bilderberg, Trilateral Commission, and CFR. Deputy National Security Advisor Thomas Donilon, Trilateral Commission, CFR. Special State Department Envoy Henry Kissinger, Bilderberg Group, Trilateral Commission, and CFR. Chairman, Economic Recovery Committee, Paul Volcker, Bilderberg Group, Trilateral Commission, Council on Foreign Relations. Director of National Intelligence, Admiral Dennis C. Blair, Bilderberg Group, Trilateral Commission, CFR. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, Bilderberg Group, Trilateral Commission, CFR. Deputy Secretary of State, James Steinberg, Bilderberg Group, Trilateral Commission, CFR. State Department Special Envoy, Richard Haas, Bilderberg Group, Trilateral Commission, and President of the CFR. Obama Presidential Advisor Alan Greenspan, Bilderberg Group, Trilateral Commission, CFR. State Department Special Envoy Richard C. Holbrooke, Bilderberg, Trilateral, CFR. And the list goes on and on.
Change means nothing. It's just a word, and it's a cliche. And just to repeat it has no meaning. What are you going to change? And I would argue, you offer no change.
When the Messiah speaks, the youth will hear.
And yea, as he grew, the child walked in the path of righteousness, with only the occasional detour into the odd weed and a little blow. When he was 12 years old, they found him in the temple in the city of Chicago, arguing the finer points of community organization with the prophet Jeremiah and the elders.
Thank you.
He traveled fleet of foot and light of camel, with a small retinue that consisted only of his loyal disciples from the tribe of the Media.
Now you listen here. He's not the Messiah. He's a very naughty boy.
Sorry ass motherfucker got nothing on me, right? Nothing.
Many people are misled by formalities. They assume, for example, that the United States went to war against Germany and Japan only after its declarations of war against these nations in December 1941. In truth, the United States had been at war for a long time before making these declarations. Its war-making took a variety of forms. For example, the U.S. Navy conducted so-called shoot-on-sight convoys that might include British ships in the North Atlantic along the greater part of the shipping route from the United States to Great Britain. Even though German U-boats had orders to refrain, and did refrain, from initiating attacks on U.S. shipping. The United States and Great Britain entered into arrangements to pool intelligence, combine weapons development, test military equipment jointly, and undertake other forms of war-related cooperation. The U.S. military actively cooperated with the British military in combat operations against the Germans, for example, by alerting the British Navy of aerial or marine sightings of German submarines, which the British then attacked. The U.S. government undertook in countless ways to provide military and other supplies and assistance to the British, the French, the Soviets who were fighting the Germans. The U.S. government also provided military and other supplies and assistance, including warplanes and pilots, to the Chinese, who were at war with Japan. The U.S. military actively engaged in planning with the British Commonwealth countries, and the Dutch East Indies for future combined combat operations against Japan. Most important, the U.S. government engaged in a series of increasingly stringent economic warfare measures that pushed the Japanese into a predicament that the U.S. authorities well understood would probably provoke them to attack U.S. territories and forces in the Pacific region in a quest to secure essential raw materials that the Americans, British, and Dutch, government in exile, had embargoed. Consider these summary statements by George Victor. And by the way, George Victor is by no means a Roosevelt basher, and it's the other way around. He greatly admires Roosevelt and entirely approves of the actions Roosevelt took to bring the United States into the war. So that's why I think he makes a good source for my purposes. You know, he didn't set out to provide grist for my mill. He has a very nice book, however, called The Pearl Harbor Myth, which I believe is completely honest and well done in its documentation. I'm going to read a long excerpt from that book by George Victor. Roosevelt had already led the United States into war with Germany in the spring of 1941, into a shooting war on a small scale. From then on, he gradually increased U.S. military participation. Japan's attack on December 7 enabled him to increase it further and to obtain a war declaration. Pearl Harbor is more fully accounted for as the end of a long chain of events, with the U.S. contribution reflecting a strategy formulated after France fell in the spring of 1941. In the eyes of Roosevelt and his advisors, the measures taken early in 1941 justified a German declaration of war on the United States, a declaration that did not come, to their disappointment. Roosevelt told his ambassador to France, William Bullitt, that U.S. entry into war against Germany was certain, but must wait for an incident, which he was confident the Germans would give us. Establishing a record in which the enemy fired the first shot was a theme that ran through Roosevelt's tactics. He seems eventually to have concluded, correctly as it turned out, that Japan would be easier to provoke into a major attack on the United States than Germany would be. Still reading from George Victor, the claim that Japan attacked the United States without provocation was typical rhetoric. It worked because the public did not know that the administration had expected Japan to respond with war to anti-Japanese measures it had taken in July 1941. Expecting to lose a war with the United States and lose it disastrously, Japan's leaders had tried with growing desperation to negotiate. On this point, most historians have long agreed. Meanwhile, evidence has come out that Roosevelt and Hull persistently refused to negotiate. Japan offered compromises and concessions, which the United States countered with increasing demands. It was after learning of Japan's decision to go to war with the United States if the talks, quote, break down, that Roosevelt decided to break them off. According to Attorney General Francis Biddle, Roosevelt said he hoped for an incident in the Pacific to bring the United States into the European war. It's the end of my quote from George Victor. These facts and numerous others that point in the same direction are, for the most part, anything but new. Many of them have been available to the public since the 1940s. As early as 1953, anyone might have read a collection of heavily documented essays on various aspects of U.S. foreign policy in the late 1930s and early 1940s, edited by Harry Elmer Barnes, that showed the numerous ways in which the U.S. government bore responsibility for the country's eventual engagement in World War II, showed, in short, that the Roosevelt administration wanted to get the country into the war and worked craftily along various avenues to ensure that sooner or later it would get in, preferably in a way that would unite public opinion behind the war by making the United States appear to have been the victim of an aggressor's unprovoked attack. As Secretary of War Henry Stimson testified after the war, quote, "We needed the Japanese to commit the first overt act," close quote. At present, however, 70 years after these events, probably not one American in 1,000, maybe not one in 10,000, has an inkling of any of this history. So effective has been the pro-Roosevelt, pro-American, pro-World War II faction that in this country it has utterly dominated teaching and popular writing about U.S. engagement in the so-called Good War. Now, I want to retrace my steps here, providing a little more context for what I've just said and some additional details. In the late 19th century, Japan's economy began to grow and to industrialize rapidly. Because Japan has few natural resources, many of its burgeoning industries had to rely on imported raw materials, such as coal, iron ore or steel scrap, tin, copper, bauxite, rubber, and petroleum. Without access to such imports, many of which came from the United States or from European colonies in Southeast Asia, Japan's industrial economy would have ground to a halt. By engaging in international trade, however, the Japanese had built a moderately advanced industrial economy by 1941. At the same time, they built a military-industrial complex to support an increasingly powerful Army and Navy. These armed forces allowed Japan to project its power into various places in the Pacific and East Asia, including Korea and northern China, much as the United States had used its growing industrial might to equip armed forces that projected U.S. power into the Caribbean, Latin America, and even as far away as the Philippine Islands. When Franklin D. Roosevelt became president in 1933, the U.S. government fell under the control of a man who disliked the Japanese and harbored a romantic affection for the Chinese because, some writers have speculated, Roosevelt's ancestors had made money in the China trade. Roosevelt also disliked the Germans in general, and Adolf Hitler in particular, and he tended to favor the British in his personal relations and in world affairs. He did not pay much attention to foreign policy, however, until his New Deal began to peter out in 1937. Thereafter, he relied heavily on foreign policy to fulfill his political ambitions, including his desire for re-election to an unprecedented third term. When Germany began to rearm and to seek Lebensraum aggressively in the late 1930s, the Roosevelt administration cooperated closely with the British and the French in measures to oppose German expansion. After World War II commenced in 1939, this U.S. assistance grew ever greater and included such measures as the so-called Destroyer Deal and the deceptively named Lend-Lease program. In anticipation of U.S. entry into the war, the British and U.S. military staffs secretly formulated plans for joint operations. U.S. forces sought to create a war-justifying incident by cooperating with the British Navy in attacks on German U-boats in the North Atlantic. But Hitler refused to take the bait, thus denying Roosevelt the pretext he craved for making the United States a full-fledged declared belligerent, a belligerence that the great majority of Americans opposed. In June 1940, Henry Stimson, who had been Secretary of War under Taft and Secretary of State under Hoover, became Secretary of War again. Stimson was a lion of the Anglophile Northeastern upper crust and no friend of the Japanese. In support of the so-called open door policy for China, Stimson favored the use of economic sanctions to obstruct Japan's advance in Asia. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau and Interior Secretary Harold Ickes vigorously endorsed this policy. Roosevelt hoped that such sanctions would goad the Japanese into making a rash mistake by launching war against the United States, which would bring in Germany because Japan and Germany were allied. The Roosevelt administration, while curtly dismissing Japanese diplomatic overtures to harmonize relations, accordingly imposed a series of increasingly stringent economic sanctions on Japan. In 1939, the United States unilaterally terminated the 1911 commercial treaty with Japan. On July 2nd, 1940, Roosevelt signed the Export Control Act, authorizing the president to license or prohibit the export of essential defense materials. Under this authority, on July 31st, exports of aviation motor fuels and lubricants and number one heavy melting iron and steel scrap were restricted. Next, in a move aimed at Japan, Roosevelt slapped an embargo effective October 16 on all exports of scrap iron and steel to destinations other than Britain and the nations of the Western Hemisphere. Finally, on July 26, 1941, Roosevelt froze Japanese assets in the United States.
In 1913, the money power of the country was taken away from the people, but it was given up in the Federal Reserve Act. The Federal Reserve is no more federal than Federal Express.
You try to hide and destroy our freedom, man. You seek agenda, we know you anti-American. You come forward American Constitution. 1913, corrupt in the system. Devalue dollar, hyperinflation. The Federal Reserve, controlled by Lucifer. He can see